Welcome everyone to our fourth and final episode on the Battle of Kings Mountain. Now over the course of the last few episodes, we've discussed a variety of topics ranging from Washington's defeats in the north to the defeats that the Patriots faced in the Southern Theater. We also see how Sir Henry Clinton, upon capturing the port of Charleston, attempted to implement the Southern strategy and thus effectively and quickly in the Revolutionary War. Now, part of the Southern strategy's tactic was to recruit and train loyalist forces in the backwoods. Of course, Cornwallis, as we found, was not too keen on this idea because he thought that these dirty shirts, as he called them, were little more than rebels in disguise, fomenters of rebellion. But the matter was taken out of his hand because just before returning to New York, Sir Henry Clinton leaves in charge of this position the young 35-year-old major of the 71st Highland Regiment, Patrick Ferguson. Now, as Ferguson is recruiting and training loyalist militia in the backwoods, the previously unconcerned backwoodsmen start to take note of this action. Prior to this, they had in some way, shape, or form started to take up arms against the British following the Waxhaws Massacre, in which Bannister Taunton and his dragoons had annihilated the command of Abraham Buford and his Virginia militia. Now, at this point, with the backwoods militia harassing British supply lines and cutting down their forces at every creek crossing between here and the north, Ferguson had had it up to here, and he sends an ill-fated letter to the leaders of the overmountain communities, threatening leader and populace alike. It was this letter, this threat, that would lead to John Sevier, Isaac Shelby, and others gathering at the sycamore shoals below Fort Watauga to assemble and head down into the backwoods to hunt and find the man that they named the Bulldog. But this led them in turn, after leaving the cowpens, to the house of these two elderly women from whom John Sevier and them hoped to gain information as to Ferguson's whereabouts. At this point, a young man would step up to volunteer his services and in turn would step onto the pages of history. There was a young man, you see, in that group called Enoch Gilmer, and he told that John Sevier and the others that he would be able to get any of the information that they sought for. Well, of course, some of them were skeptical about this plan because he was a little more than a boy at the time. But others swore by the plan, for they said that Enoch was such a good actor that he could find out anything about this region much better than someone who was acquainted with it. And when he went into his act, he could pull off any character. In fact, they said he could laugh and cry simultaneously. At this point, we see that deceit and play acting is quite literally what the fate of the revolution in the South is possibly hanging on. Nonetheless, they devised a plan with Enoch in tow, and Enoch walks up to the door of the ladies and knocks on the door and asks, "Where is Ferguson?" Because, as posing as a loyalist militia, he wishes to join Ferguson's forces. Well, the ladies, they said, "We know exactly where he is. As a matter of fact, we've been taking eggs up to his camp over there at Kings Mountain." Enoch could hardly believe his luck. But his luck was multiplied when the two women, seeing the state of the young lad, invited him in for a bite to eat. And right as he had just finished his meal, the door burst open, and in strode William Campbell, one of the leaders of the Patriot band. And he says, "Aha! I've got you now, you damned rascal!" Enoch stood up straight and replied, "A true kingsman, by God!" At which William Campbell was prompted to throw a noose over the neck of Enoch, who broke down into tears and began to beg and plead for his life. And this, of course, led to the two women beginning to sob and plead, "Don't kill him, he's just a boy." One of the Patriots said, "Well, so as not to offend these lovely ladies here, why don't we go ahead and take him on down the road and hang him at the first stooping limb that we pass by?" Enoch begged and pleaded for mercy, but there was nothing to be done about it, for William Campbell and his Patriot jack-booted thugs, well, they took Enoch out of there, mounted him to his horse, and they rode off down the road. And as the two women stood there sobbing and wringing their hands for the poor boy, his cries faded into the distance. But unbeknownst to the women, although silence yet again reigned supreme on their homestead, the cries of Enoch Gilmer had not been cut off by the hangman's noose. For in fact, no sooner had they rounded the bend than William Campbell removed the noose from the neck of Enoch and asked, "Did you find what we needed?" He says, "Oh, most assuredly I have. Take me back to Sevier and Shelby and the others. We've got some riding to do." They rode back and they spread the news that Ferguson was a short trip away at Kings Mountain. And this encouraged the men to ride on with as much resolve as hounds chasing after the deer. But the resolve began to weaken at about midday, for due to hunger and exhaustion, some of the men and their horses began to tire out, and they wanted to stop and take a rest. Isaac Shelby grew incensed at this, and he said, "Rest? I will not rest until I ride through the very lines of Cornwallis himself. Press on, men!" And so they pressed on through swollen rivers, until finally, at around 3 a.m., the rain had let up, and the soiled band of backwoodsmen found themselves at the base of Kings Mountain. At this point, silent as ghosts, they dismount from their steeds and make their way around the base of the mountain, silently killing any of the loyalist scouts that had been sent out. Now, while this was going on, Ferguson was not completely unaware of what was transpiring, because thanks to the efforts of his scouts, he knew that close to 1,000 of these backwoodsmen were making their way towards his position. Now, he felt confident in his entrenchments, but he did want to be on the safe side with how many men he could put into action against these dirty shirts. So he sends word to Cornwallis, about 70 miles east in Charlotte, North Carolina, to send reinforcements to his position. However, no help would come because Cornwallis was sick of bed with a cold. Nonetheless, as previously stated, Ferguson was confident in his entrenchments atop Kings Mountain, so much so that before the battle commenced, he stated that not even God nor all of his angels would be able to remove him from this mountain. Ferguson was going to find out just how prophetic his words truly were. Now, at the base of the mountain, the overmountain men are getting ready. They're looking to see that their guns are ready primed and their flints are ready picked, and they're making sure that their knife belts are tightened with knife and tomahawk in tow. Right before they start their climb to the top of the mountain, Isaac Shelby ignites his men with an impassioned plea, saying, "Do not wait for the word of command. Let each of you be his own officer. When in the woods, shelter yourselves and take as much care as you can of yourselves. If in the woods, hide from tree to tree, killing and disabling and pressing the enemy as much as you can." Thus, with this speech, the overmountain men began to make their way up to the top of Kings Mountain, and the watchword, shouted as they charged, was Buford. Now it was on. It was off to the races, folks, because as the band of backwoodsmen made their way up the climb, the loyalist militia stood firm, and they began to fire volley after volley down upon the overmountain men. But their position atop the ridge caused their shots to fly high, whereas the deadly accurate rifle fire from the long rifles of these backwoodsmen proved to be deadly effective. In fact, we see that Ferguson's forces began dropping fairly quickly, and at one point it was said that some of his forces, seeing that their numbers were thinning, took off strips of their hunting shirts, tied them to their rifles, and waved them in surrender. But Ferguson would have none of it. Riding along the lines, saber in hand, he rode up and he knocked their muskets out of hand and say, "If you deem yourself a man, then stand and fight as one." And the fighting continued. Now, at one point, Ferguson did in fact try to successfully employ the bayonet charge, which he did so twice. But the bayonet charge proved relatively ineffective. For the fact of the matter is that no sooner did the Loyalists charge with their bayonets, the overmountain men would retreat back down the mountain just long enough to reload their rifles before they came back up whooping and hollering for more. And in some cases, especially after the third charge, the Patriots got so close to the Loyalist militia that rifle could no longer take effect and tomahawk and knife came into play. Now, at one point in the battle, amidst all the haze and confusion of the battle and the gun smoke, we see that a lone figure, mounted astride a horse, starts riding down towards the Patriot lines. It is but one of two of Ferguson's mistresses, Virginia Paul. Her compatriot, Virginia Sal, was shot by an errant bullet which had flown into camp, killing her that day. Now, it is said that as she rides through the Patriot lines, she stops long enough to point out what Ferguson is wearing, a checkered shirt. Now, at this point, Ferguson's men are starting to be pressed back to back, getting caught in a deadly crossfire. Ferguson himself, with his checkered shirt, silver whistle, and saber in hand, made for a mighty fine target. And it is said that at least 7 men successfully got off shots at Ferguson. And it was the sudden impact of those 7 heavy lead balls that struck Ferguson in the torso, lifted him up out of the saddle. But the problem was his foot hung in the stirrup, and his horse drug him down to the Patriot lines. And we see that finally a young colonel named Williams calls his mount to a stop and tries to aid Ferguson despite being mortally wounded. But in a last act of defiance, Ferguson pulls a pistol from his belt, points it at the stomach of Williams, and fires. And this act so enraged the other men who were present that they fired upon Ferguson and killed him instantly. From there, the battle devolved into a total rout, with Loyalist forces suffering casualties of 223 dead and 168 wounded. And in fact, there were 716 prisoners captured that day. But of all the prisoners that were captured, in that time, before a halt could be called to the madness, the Patriots had convened an impromptu court and had sentenced 36 of the men to death by hanging. Of that 36, they had hung 9 before John Sevier, William Campbell, Isaac Shelby, and others could call a halt to the madness. But after the battle was over, the Patriots sent their prisoners on to Salem and Moravian Town, and then went back home. Home to tend their crops, their livestock, home to take care of their families. But in that time, although their part of the war was over, in a battle lasting only 65 minutes, they had planted a seed of liberty that would blossom into American independence on that mountain. Now, when Cornwallis and Charlotte heard the news of Ferguson's defeat, it scared the daylights out of him, so much so that he retreated south to Winnsboro, South Carolina for the winter. But of course, like any good commander, he had to continue along with the plan of attack. And so the next spring he moves his army again to the north, but this time you can be assured that he avoided the western frontier as much as possible, likening being in the midst of those dirty shirts to sitting naked on a hornet's nest. Well, of course, we know Cornwallis did in fact take a turn to the east, a little bit too far, if I might say so myself, for the fact of the matter is that he soon found himself holed up by a combined force of French and Americans at a place called Yorktown, Virginia. And October 19th, 1781, Cornwallis surrenders his sword to the American forces. This was the first link in a chain of events, as Sir Henry Clinton put it, that would result in the entire loss of America, but of course resulted in our independence. An independence that might not have been possible had it not for the characters of this great story. The characters of John Sevier, Isaac Shelby, Enoch Gilmer, John Crockett, and of course Mary Patton and her gunpowder. Well, folks, with that being said, this concludes today's episode. I want to thank you so much for coming along as we've explored the history behind the Battle of Kings Mountain, a battle that quite possibly was the key to America gaining its independence. So with that being said, thank you so much for following along. We want you to continue following along on Facebook and YouTube. That's the best means of support, minus the fact of the matter that you could come out to the Crockett Tavern Museum and pay us all a visit. Of course, we will be uploading on Tuesdays to tell you about some new upcoming events as we progress throughout the season. But as always, you know that our hours of operation and admissions will be listed in the description attached to the videos. Until next week, this is Isaac White signing off for now, saying goodbye and God bless.